그런데 세상을 향해 말을 할 때에는 세일이 한결같이 지탄하는 바와 같이 트럼프놈이 감히 우리 공화국을 완전히 배멸할 수 있는 나름대로 설득력 있는 발언.
국민들과 인민들을 투철한 반제의 의식과 멸종의
장본 흑계 맹세합니다. 얼마나 참혹한가를 똑똑히
오늘 고무당당히 방장을 행진해 나갔습니다. 이를 완전히 괴멸시키겠다는 반인륜적인 전대미문의 미치광이 나발까지 세계 제패의 야망을 실현하기 위해 수십만의 무고한 생명을 이에 자비적이며 정정당당한 핵무력 권유 평양시 군중 집회는 경의하는 최고 영도자 김정은 녹여주고 있습니다.
North Korea's defiance and hatred of the US on show for the world to see. Its state news agency says anti-American speeches were celebrated by an audience of more than 100,000 people in Pyongyang. Not surprising, given the decades of tensions and sanctions that the North blames on the US.
The
US has put sanctions against our country from the very first day of its foundation.
From an early age, the North Korean government teaches its citizens to hate America, and that hatred dates back to the Korean War. The conflict began in 1950. By its end in 1953, the US had dropped more than 600,000 tons of explosives, devastating the Korean peninsula, which remains divided to this day. There was no peace treaty, and the North and South are technically still at war. North Korea never forgave the United States. Its founder, Kim Il-sung, and his successors have all portrayed the US as an ever-present threat, easily done with so many US troops on its border. Despite periods where both sides made efforts to normalize relations, deals to relax economic sanctions in exchange for Pyongyang freezing its nuclear program have always broken down. And after 9/11, the rhetoric was stepped up.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, and 5 more have followed. The most recent and powerful was earlier this month. And despite decades of sanctions, it has also expanded its ballistic missiles program, saying the entire US territory is now within range. Analysts say the latest crisis needs to be put in context.
In the post-Cold War period, we have seen the United States exercising in a unilateral way regime change all around the world. So North Korea looks at Iraq, it looks at Libya as examples of potential destabilizing futures that it doesn't want.
Pyongyang has long used the fear of an American attack as a tool to unify its citizens. But the last month of insults and threats has raised tension like never before. And in a country so suspicious of outsiders and inward-looking, the danger is that actions and words could be misinterpreted with devastating consequences.
The absurd reality that a person like Trump, a mentally deranged person full of megalomania and complacence, he committed an irreversible mistake of making our rockets visit to the entire U.S. mainland inevitable.
And the president tweeting his reaction to the speech. Just heard Foreign Minister of North Korea speak at UN. If he echoes thoughts of Little Rocket Man, they won't be around much longer. So is this the toughest stance we've seen against North Korea by a president? Here to weigh in is former CIA analyst Dr. Sue Mi Terry. Dr. Terry, thank you for joining us. What do you think? I mean, the president, the toughest, bluntest talk we've heard against North Korea, who has unprecedented missile tests, more than 20 this year, some of them going over our allies. What do you make of where things stand?
Well, it's true. Certainly no U.S. president has talked in this manner, really taking a very tough stance. North Koreans were riled up before when President Bush called North Korea part of axis of evil, but I don't think they expected quite of this level of rhetoric coming out of Washington. My only concern is it's going to escalate because North Koreans cannot back down either. They have Kim Jong-un is bent on completing the nuclear program. They have always said they have to perfect their nuclear arsenal to achieve that ultimate capability to attack mainland United States with nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile. And now they will have to react to probably a 7th nuclear test or most likely another intercontinental ballistic missile test.
So the foreign minister of North Korea yesterday at the UN saying it was an irreversible megalomania act, taking an irreversible. Yeah. Are we headed towards some military action, in your opinion?
I hope, and I still believe it's not likely, just because that taking military option would mean massive casualties. I just don't see how we can avoid a big conflict on the Korean Peninsula, just because North Korea is already a nuclear power that puts Japan and South Korea under nuclear threat. We have conventional artillery pieces, North Koreans do, over 10,000 within 60 seconds of Seoul. So if we do take military action, we'll have to be prepared for retaliation from North Korea. Of course, at the end, North Korea will be devastated and utterly be destroyed in an all-out conflict, but Seoul and Japan will particularly take a big hit.
Quickly, as a former CIA analyst, in some of these countries, Iraq, Libya, when you want to do a regime change, you can get an insurgency started, you can make contact with the people, but they call it the Hermit Kingdom for a reason. It's so isolated. Yeah. Is that an option with North Korea?
I think it's very difficult with North Korea. It's the most isolated country in the face of this earth. We call North Korea a hard target for country for a reason. I think it's a very difficult option to pursue that too. So we don't have a lot of good options, I'm afraid to say.
Unfortunately,
dignity of my country by referring it to a rocket. By doing so, however, he committed an irreversible mistake of making our rocket's visit to the entire U.S. mainland inevitable all the more. None other than Trump himself is on a suicide mission.
So he takes the podium, threatens to attack the United States. Now they're also threatening to have a atmospheric nuclear warhead hydrogen bomb test in the Pacific. That hasn't happened since 1980.
Yeah. Well, as with everything North Korea says, you have to take it with several grains of salt. You know, they've got a playbook, as you and I have discussed before, of terms and language that they use. The next communication from the North Korean news agency will be to threaten the United States with destruction by a sea of fire. That's one of their favorites. What you have to do is look past that and assess what I think is the real threat here, which is that they have made very significant progress in a shorter period of time than many analysts had thought in both their ballistic and nuclear programs. And so when you get to the substance of this and what President Trump said on Tuesday, which was denuclearization of North Korea is the only path forward, that's really what it comes down to, and what we're going to do to make sure that, in fact, they are denuclearized one way or the other.
And finally, he did say, and he gave us an indication of their strategy, that they have this nuclear program for defense and to prevent an invasion of North Korea by the United States. And as he said, that they want a balance of power. They're not going to give it up, ever.
Right. They're certainly not going to give it up voluntarily. There's no question about it. And that's been true over the last 25 years as 3 successive American administrations have tried and failed to talk them out of the nuclear weapons program. That's why Trump has very few good options here. And I might just say one other thing quickly. The North Korean line is, oh, this is just for defensive purposes, which many Americans believe. It's a great tribute to North Korean propaganda. Look, this capacity is to help them take over South Korea and to become a regional power.
So finally, what do you predict?
Well, I think the next question will be whether China follows through on some of the commitments it's made to put economic pressure on North Korea. I don't think we're going to know in the near term. I think Xi Jinping's upcoming party Congress in mid-October, we're going to have to get past that to see whether China's serious this time or it's just one more example of double talk.
All right, and back. Fighters and bombers to the farthest point north of the demilitarized zone by any aircraft, American aircraft, this century. They flew in international waters to the east of North Korea. This coming after North Korean's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, he delivered a fiery speech at the United Nations yesterday. Ri, harshly slamming the president, called him, quote, mentally deranged. And saying Mr. Trump's tough talk on North Korea is making a strike against us, he said, inevitable. Well, President Trump took to Twitter, basically warning that the North will cease to exist if it attacks the U.S. Colorado Republican Senator Cory Gardner, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, also weighed in on this showdown.
We have a long ways to go to continue to ratchet up the economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea and the enablers of North Korea. Our number one goal with North Korea, as it relates to North Korea, must and always will be peaceful denuclearization of the North Korean regime.
Feel diminished. But what really concerns me, we've had these threats from North Korea to incinerate American cities for years, and we even have those entertaining videos. But something is new. With Ri Yong-ho's speech at the UN yesterday, he talked about attacking the entire U.S. mainland, but he didn't preface it with what North Koreans have always said in the past. In the past, they've said, look, if the U.S. strikes us, we will strike you. We didn't hear that yesterday from the foreign minister. And so that is a new development. And I think it indicates that there probably is a change in Kim Jong-un's mind as he views all of these developments.
So your interpretation and analysis is that they're thinking of a first strike?
Well, I don't think they're actually thinking of that, but they're talking about that, though. And, the North Koreans parsed those words very carefully. Ri Yong-ho was supposed to speak before the UN on Friday. He postponed. Obviously, the North Koreans wanted to think about what his speech would actually specifically say. So I think that you have to assume that they chose their words very carefully. Now, to me, it's incomprehensible that they would think of doing that. But nonetheless, when you look at that speech, you look at the placement of the words, you've got to be very concerned.
He basically called the U.S. the enemy, said the Korean War is continuing, hasn't ended, and they fear an attack by the U.S., and they say the nuclear program is for defensive purposes. Let's listen to a little more of what Ri Yong-ho said at the United Nations.
What else could be a bigger threat than the violent remarks such as pouring, fire and fury, total destruction coming from the top authority of the world's biggest nuclear power? The very reason the DPRK had to possess nuclear weapons is because of the US, and it had to strengthen and develop its nuclear force onto the current level to cope with the U.S.
There he's saying it's, our fault.
Yeah, the North Koreans have always said that. They've had a nuclear weapons program since at least 1965, when Kim Il-sung, the founder of the regime, asked for technology from the Chinese. They probably even had a program before that. This has nothing to do with President Trump's words of fire and fury or the rest of it. And we got to remember that when President Trump said that he would totally destroy North Korea, this was his Tuesday UN speech, he preceded it by some very important words. And that was, if the United States is forced to defend itself or its allies. So, President Trump has been careful. Even though he uses bombastic language, he couches it in self-defense.
And
the North Koreans aren't doing this.
That's always been the U.S. policy through other presidents anyway, hasn't it been?
It has been. And matter of fact, if you look at President Trump's words, and fiery as they were, they really were just a restatement of U.S. deterrence policy, which has always talked about massive retaliation if the United States is attacked. So in substance, they weren't anything new. Now, of course, President Trump has used language which is more bellicose, but when you look at the substance, really nothing has changed.
Yeah, something else that I caught in the speech, which I thought was just really a nugget. I mean, he totally rejects Security Council resolutions, rejects the international law and the international legitimacy of the Security Council and the 9 resolutions. Let's listen to what Ri Yong-ho said about that.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a responsible nuclear weapon state. We will take preventative measures by merciless preemptive action in case the U.S. and its vessel forces show any sign of conducting a kind of decapitating operation on our headquarters or military attack against our country.
Finally, he said merciless preemptive action if there's any type of decapitation strike or attack. I mean, what exactly is he talking about?
Well, it's actually even worse than that, Eric, because he talked about a preventative strike. Preemption is recognized that country can preempt another country if an attack is imminent. He talked about preventative, which is not an attack that because something is imminent. It's to prevent your opponent from getting a capability or from doing something. And so this is even more provocative than we first thought when we started to listen to his speech.